Good afternoon. My name is Rosie Gomez, and I'm a next generation leader at the McCain Institute from the United States. And at the completion of my program year, I will address anti-human trafficking efforts within the child welfare population by establishing public-private partnerships at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It is my pleasure to introduce the Sedona Humanitarian Focus Panel, moderated by Ernie Allen from Allen Global Consulting LLC.
Good afternoon. We recognize that millions of Americans and lots of people around the world think that human slavery ended 150 years ago. But we're going to talk with you today about the reality that it didn't. It's alive and well in the United States and around the world. And we have an extraordinary panel that's going to discuss today how we can address that problem more effectively and bring it to an end. But before we do that, I want to introduce one of the members of our panel who is the proverbial person who needs no introduction. Businesswoman, entrepreneur, philanthropist, humanitarian, activist, and the face and voice of the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery in the United States, Cindy McCain.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be very quick, but what I would like to do is have all the members of the McCain Institute Human Trafficking Advisory Board to please stand up. I'd like you to see who these amazing folks are. Please stand up. Ernie, you stand up too. These are why these folks are leaders in their own rights around the world working on this issue diligently, and I'm very honored to be able to work with them, and I wanted you to know them. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. Well, we have a remarkable panel today. And I want to give you just a brief introduction of each, and then we'll have a discussion. We want to hear from you. We want this to be interactive. But on my left is Nick Grono, an Australian lawyer and human rights activist. Nick is the inaugural CEO of an extraordinary global initiative, a private sector initiative to try to eradicate human slavery called the Freedom Fund. Prior to that, Nick was the inaugural CEO of the Walk Free Foundation, created by Australian philanthropist Andrew Forrest, that, among other things, produced the Global Slavery Index, which for the first time helped the world understand the true scope of this problem. Next to Nick is Kevin Hyland. And Kevin is the United Kingdom's first independent anti-slavery commissioner, a position created as a result of the Modern Slavery Act, which was spearheaded by the then Home Secretary and now Prime Minister, Theresa May. So Kevin is the leader in the United Kingdom on the issue of eradicating modern slavery and is mobilizing law enforcement and other leaders around the world. You know Cindy well, but let's start with Nick. Nick, tell us about the Freedom Fund and tell us about the kind of impact that it's having, your vision and how you think the Freedom Fund will eradicate the problem of modern slavery.
It's a small challenge, right, to eradicate modern slavery. And when we're talking about the problem, I think we need to start by understanding the scale of the problem. But we have a problem there in that we don't know how big the problem is. Right? The data in this space is really weak. And that's not surprising because slavery is a hidden crime. Right? So those enslaving other individuals, depriving of their liberty, don't go freely admit that they're enslaving others. We have a couple of estimates. One put out by the UN about 5 years ago that said there are about 21 million people around the world in forced labor. And then another estimate put out by the Global Slavery Index by Walk Free Foundation came out last year and said about 46 million people in modern slavery. So you've got quite a range there, which just illustrates some of the real challenges in understanding the scale of the problem. You'll be pleased to hear that Walk Free and the UN are coming together this year to put out a single number. So they're working in coming up with a new estimate. And I look forward to seeing that in September. And there's one other number I think that's really important. is to understand this is a hugely profitable criminal enterprise. Again, the UN came out with an estimate that the annual profits from slavery, this was in 2014, were $150 billion a year. And that was predicated on their 21 million population. So if you have a higher population, they're vastly, vastly higher than that, a massively profitable criminal enterprise. So when it comes to tackling slavery, that's the challenge. And I think what we have to do, and certainly the approach we take at the Freedom Fund, is we have to tackle the systems. We have to dismantle the systems and the infrastructure that enable slavery to take place. Because slavery isn't just about a really evil perpetrator enslaving a victim, right? It's not just about a Thai fishing boat captain enslaving a Cambodian migrant, or a brothel owner in Mumbai enslaving a girl from Nepal. That's part of it, but there is this infrastructure that facilitates all of this. There's the recruiters that lure these people into these positions of exploitation. There's the fact that slavery is illegal everywhere and it thrives, so the law is not being enforced. There's corruption by officials, by police, or they turn a blind eye. Right? That's what enables all of this. And then, of course, you have these hugely vulnerable populations. Those are the people who are being enslaved. I mean, with all kind of fairness to taken and so on, no one in this room is going to be subject to human trafficking or exploitation. It's the vulnerable population. It's the migrants. It's those being forced to flee Syria. It's the unaccompanied children trying to make their way into Europe. It's migrants, or I was just in Myanmar. It's Rohingya being subject to persecution because of their religion. It's well, the list goes on. It's people who are vulnerable because of their religious status, their ethnic status, their migrant status, or because they're women or girls. And so the approach we take at the Freedom Fund is, how do you tackle these systems? And our three founders, Humanitarian United, represented here today by Randy Newcomb, the foundation of Pam and Pierre Midia, and Walk Free Foundation and Legatum, wanted to take an approach to the systems. And so what they said was, we'll tackle the systems by focusing on those that can get to the vulnerable populations, which is frontline groups working in these really difficult places in Bihar, in southeastern Nepal. The way we drive sustainable change is by working with really courageous frontline organizations that day in, day out deal with the traffickers, the victims, the corrupt officials, and are the ones that can drive sustainable change over time. So we now partner with 100 organizations around the world, 100 local organizations in India, Ethiopia, Thailand, Nepal, and empower them, bring them together, give them the funding and the capacity so that they can work together much more effectively, and basically just by sheer force of will, drive change in those communities where people are being exploited, right? By bringing law cases against officials that aren't doing the prosecutions, by getting the victims and giving them alternate livelihoods, by just changing the normative behavior that says slavery is acceptable in so many of these environments. So that's the big challenge that we've set ourselves.
Kevin, in addition to being the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, spent 30 years in British law enforcement at Scotland Yard. He headed the anti-trafficking unit, the Metropolitan Police. And I know one of the areas that you're focusing on as the UK's Anti-Slavery Commissioner is law enforcement, and the reality that these are crimes. This is organized crime in many ways. It's profitable, it's easy, there's huge consumer marketplace for us. Talk about what you're doing as the Anti-Slavery Commissioner and how you're impacting that niche.
Sure. And firstly, can I thank everyone who is doing so much around the world to respond to this, Nick and the representatives here and Mrs. McCain, for what you're doing. It is making a difference. But I think, we heard about it today. We heard about vacuums that exist, and we hear about how criminals and evil people will fill them vacuums. And I think across the world, we see that in modern slavery and human trafficking. And the UK responded to that by introducing the Modern Slavery Act. And that creates laws where people can face life imprisonment, give power to the law enforcement agencies to take action before crimes are committed, allows us to have the most robust processes for taking the assets from the criminals, and then also gives more protection to the victims and those assets to be given to the victims, but also then creates accountability for the private sector, who have to do statements on an annual basis to show what they're doing, and they have to be signed off at director level, at board level, and published on their websites. And it created my role as the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. And I've got a statutory footing over all law enforcement in the UK, all the health service in the UK, immigration services, and local governments. And I can make recommendations to them, and they have to fulfill them or cooperate with them. But when I look at this, one of the areas that we have left happen is it's 150 billion US dollars being earned by criminals. But across the globe, OECD countries are only spending 0.08% of that $150 billion on fighting this. So it's an unfair fight. And we've got the situation where we have corruption, we have migrants on the move, we've got an estimate between 21 and 45 million people being exploited, and the criminals are acting with impunity. It's a crime of choice. It's a crime where it pays to commit this. As a law enforcement officer for 30 years, I spent time in homicide, in drugs, in firearms, and in vulnerability. But actually, if I was a criminal today, you'd get caught for those crimes. You'd have big assets pursuing you. But actually, on this crime, you'll get away with it. And there's an enormous commodity there of people who are vulnerable. And when I look at the intelligence, I heard a great expression earlier in one of the presentations, let's look at the facts. And we need to look at the facts. We need to look at the intelligence and then build up responses. And if we look where that has been successful, if we look at the Italians and our national crime agencies work together, particularly in areas such as the routes up through North Africa and right back to Nigeria, if we look at those figures at the moment, criminals are operating there with impunity. But they actually arrested one man recently who had trafficked and smuggled 8,000 people and was charging them up to $10,000 a time to get across the Mediterranean. It's big money. But then if we look at the vacuums that have been created in places like Libya, and then that we see that criminals have gone in there and they're using women and girls to fund their activities, funding the militia. We know that ISIS and Daesh are using trafficking and the sale of women to fund their activities. So it's so interlinked to other security measures. But I think, as we heard also, we can't do this just on rule of law. And my role is about working internationally. And I've been looking at areas like Nigeria and how we can go in there, give them development opportunities, how we can also give them community awareness. We heard about one press of a button on the internet, and it can cause chaos. And when I've been to places like Nigeria, the messages getting through to the people on the ground who've come to Europe are being sent out every day. But we are doing very little messaging back there. And that issue of Nigerians coming to Europe, last year, 11,000 women arrived in southern Italy from Nigeria. And we know that the vast majority of those come from one state in Nigeria, Edo State. But what is the law enforcement response there? What are the development opportunities there? And how are we actually engaging with those communities to make sure that we make it that they don't want to come, but we pursue those criminals who are engaging in that all the way along the route. They are organised, but we're not doing an organised response, and that's what I want to see. And when I've met those families, when I go to the most rural parts of Nigeria, and I've met families, and I met a woman who was in a camp where there was mainly people who had suffered from leprosy. And she said to me, we've cured leprosy. You've cured it. You came and helped us, and our children won't get leprosy. But actually now other people are coming, and they're trading in our children. They're buying and selling our children. And what are you doing about it? How can you help us? She said, we've got the internet here. We've got smartphones. We can hear the criminals speaking to us. But what are you speaking to us about? So I think it's important we go and we work with those law enforcement agencies. We give them the skills. And in the UK, for example, the Prime Minister now heads up a task force. On that is our national security. And all our security assets are on that. And other parts of government. And then we discuss and come up with measures, how we can cut this off at source, how we can deal with it upstream. Because it's too late when the bodies are floating in the Mediterranean or when people are actually stuck in Libya, where they are being kept for months on end in collection houses, and girls are raped and exploited every day until they earn their passage across the Mediterranean. And recently we heard that the traffickers are actually removing males from the boats that are leaving Libya and putting young women and girls in there because they're more valuable when they arrive in Europe. So we need to change the game. We need to step up the game. We need to deal with this as it is, a rule of law. We need to chase those assets, but also back in the communities, we need to give them the messages, and we need to give them the development opportunities so they can survive. Because at the moment, there are voids there where evil people and criminals are ruling the roost, and also there is impunity. It's a crime of choice. As I say, in my 30 years of law enforcement, this is a crime that I see. There is nobody really pursuing it on a global level that there should be. And we need to change that and use all the intelligence resources we have to pursue those criminals so it becomes a crime of high risk to the criminals and low profit. Because at the moment, it's extremely high profit with very low risk to the criminals.
Kevin, thank you. As you can see, there's extraordinary global leadership in this space that is taking place. But I want to ask Cindy, when you ask the typical American today about this problem, the response is, yeah, that's a problem in Southeast Asia. That's a problem in Nigeria. That's a problem somewhere else on the other side of the world. And Cindy, you've been a global leader on this, but you've also been a leader in Arizona and nationwide. Could you talk about the challenges that we face in the United States?
You bring up a really, really good point on this. As much work as we do on this, we still have a large portion of the United States that does not believe this exists. I've been to major countries around the world that denied it's part of what goes on, and when you can see it in the streets. Here at home in the United States, I think we're in the middle of a perfect storm right now. The iron's hot. It's time to strike on this issue because people are beginning to talk about it. Because so many of us have been so busy, yapping about this and meeting with people and doing conferences, et cetera, that people are beginning to hear it. Now, they don't necessarily understand it completely, but it's part of the conversation now. And that's right there in me is the first giant step to making sure that we can at least work hard on this issue and make a difference on it. But I will also say that we still deal with many more rural communities, I will say, that simply don't have the means, don't have the wherewithal, don't have the training to even begin. There's too many other problems to even begin this, and I'll use the southern border as a perfect example for that.
So I think the progress that we're making in the United States is extraordinary, but the challenge is huge. And Nick, as I look around the room and I see corporate leaders, senior executives like John Chambers and Jeff Immelt and others, the multinational corporation today is dealing with supply chains that may number in the dozens of suppliers. I'd like to ask you about how we can mobilize it. I talk about Jeff Immelt and GE all the time and your integrated reporting. You've brought together financial and non-financial reporting to try to increase corporate awareness. What's the Freedom Fund doing? How can we engage corporate leaders more effectively in this effort?
So, look, the reality is with transnational supply chains these days, all of us are touched by slavery. The cotton I wear may have been produced in somewhere like Uzbekistan, where the government puts a large chunk of its population into forced labor every year to pick the crops. May have been manufactured into cotton cloth in southern India, where we're working by girls who are locked up in hostels and forced to work. Smartphones, we heard yesterday about coltan being mined in eastern Congo by people in forced labor. It makes its way into our supply chains. The tuna, the seafood that we eat, I trust not here, but tuna and seafood sourced from Thailand is being fished by Burmese and Cambodian migrants enslaved on fishing boats. And we have these extremely complex supply chains these days. And I think we've probably passed peak supply chain extension. It's a very important and powerful way to minimize costs, to produce goods for consumers at very, very low cost. That is tremendously important. But sometimes, and too often it's been done by closing a blind eye to the exploitation that happens many layers down at the mine in the Congo or at the little factory in Bangladesh or somewhere like that. That's changing, right? It's changing in very significant part because of groundbreaking legislation in California and last year, or year before last, in the UK that requires companies just to state what their policies are on forced labour and on slavery. There's no punitive sanctions, but it just requires them to put out a statement signed by director, approved by the board. What that's doing is getting companies to start thinking about this. And particularly, there's been many companies that have been ahead of the curve on this, and I'm sure a number of them are here. But there are also many laggards, and a lot of this has come to light with some amazing investigative reporting that's been done in the New York Times, The Guardian, Associated Press around the Thai seafood industry, off the back of some magnificent work that's been done by Humanity United over the years to shine a spotlight on this, and showing that these people enslaved on these fishing boats are producing fish or fish that's turned into fish meal for the prawn farms that produces the seafood that end up on our shelves. And major corporations are implicated in this. And this is all on record. And they've come out, and many of them very, I think, deserve a lot of congratulations. Nestle's come out and said, our seafood supply chain has forced labor in it. Right? Costco, Mars, British firms, Tesco's have said, we are trying to get to grips with these problems. So the way it needs to be done is we need to shine a spotlight on it. Companies need to take the lead in actually examining their own supply chains, not to show that there is no slavery, because the reality is if you're sourcing from a very low-cost environment, many, many layers down, there is a very high risk of forced labor. To actually find the problem and then deal with it appropriately, that's what needs to be done. And then corporate leaders who actually show that kind of leadership need to bring other corporate leaders along with them, because it's not just good to have someone that's, the one single figurehead that we kind of all celebrate, Unilever and others. We need the whole industry to come along and say, enslavement of fellow human beings to produce the goods that end up in our supply chains is utterly unacceptable, and we're committed to making a change. So that's the kind of effort that we think we need to see.
That's great. And Kevin, I wanted to follow up with you. I know the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office is also looking at supply chain issues. But what I wanted to specifically ask you about is, I think we've learned that this is a problem that if it's saleable, if there's some aspect of a human being that is saleable, the traffickers, the suppliers, will sell it to somebody. So I know you just participated in a conference at the Vatican, Pope Francis convened, that looked at the issue of human slavery, human trafficking as it relates to organ transplant, organ harvesting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, there's parts of the world where the trade in organs, and particularly children being traded for their organs, is rife. And people who are vulnerable, people who have no choice, will follow that up. Will actually volunteer to give a lung or a kidney. They will consent to that. But the problem is, the operation may happen, but the follow-up doesn't, and they will die. And this is big trade. This is big trade in certain parts of the globe. And it's something that can be addressed. It's around, some of it is around policy that needs to be improved in the developed parts of the world. Some of the policies about organ donation. But also, again, I go back to the fact that the criminality, what is the pursuit of the criminals in those parts of the world? And how much effort is being put by the international community on those countries where a commodity, which is a person, which can be traded multiple times by the same criminal group, for whatever they want to exploit them for, organs, sexual exploitation, forced labor, forced criminality. And we talk about domestically as well. In the UK, we estimate there's 13,000 people in modern slavery. Our numbers of identification of victims has gone up over the last 2 years significantly. Our prosecutions have gone up. And we're seeing, the criminals becoming more innovative. They're looking for different ways. When the law enforcement pursue them, they will design new ways of using technology or whatever it may be. But actually, at the moment, when we think of these crimes happening in our neighboring countries or in our own domestic countries, and I look at what is the resources put into this. And one of the figures, Nick spoke about the 45 million. If we go back to the transatlantic times, when the UK led on that before, over the 200 years of the transatlantic slave trade, it was estimated there were between 10 and 12 million people in slavery. Nowadays, today, it's estimated there could be as many as 45 million, just today. That shows what the problem is, how significant a problem this is, and actually what is the response to it by the international community. Now, I recently spoke at the Security Council on this issue, and looked at how we can incorporate this into peacekeeping. Peacekeeping, we have peacekeepers all over the world. Sometimes they're committing the offences, but actually they can do a lot on this. And the peacekeeping also includes a lot of law enforcement officials. We need this in their programming. And in humanitarian responses, we need the UN programs to have modern slavery, human trafficking element, on all of those, because that's an enormous resource that we've got available to us. And we need to see those used more effectively because they are in the regions as well where this is rife, and the types of trafficking we're talking about when children are trafficked for all sorts of issues. So we need to be more innovative, use what's there already, but then also we need to see this as a crime. And when it's in the supply chain transparency that we're talking about, this isn't an audited issue. This isn't something where, it's a bad audit system. This is organized criminality. And I don't think there's any CAO anywhere in the world that wants to produce an item that has been made at the cost of a human life. And that human life could be a 9-year-old in a mine. I don't think anybody could stand up and say, I support that. And that's the one thing that's different about modern slavery and human trafficking, is that people are very clear that it cannot exist and shouldn't exist in the modern society. So that gives us a real clear mandate of what we need to do.
The challenge is enormous. Cindy, one of the realities that you focused through the Advisory Council is the fact that this is not only a problem that has grown, but it's a problem that's migrated. Mm-hmm. It's migrated from the streets to the internet, where the traffickers, where the slave traders can operate more easily and with far less risk. What are you doing? What are your thoughts about how we can address the challenge represented by the internet?
The internet is, in my opinion, the biggest danger of all on this. I'm happy to say that my husband with Senator Klobuchar and Senator Heitkamp and others are working very hard to help change some of the laws that affect our inability to prosecute people like Backpage.com and others for the sale of minors for sex online. It is, when the internet, when Al Gore invented the internet, we couldn't envision where it would take us, and none of us could envision that the sale of human beings would ever take place. So now we need to amend the CDA. We need to make other changes with regards to how we treat these entities online. But with that said, the dark web presents an extraordinary problem. Our group Thorn, who's in the audience today, is working very hard on the digital aspect of the sale of human beings. There is, in my opinion, it is as large in numbers as some of the numbers we're hearing here because of the ease of it, because of the absolute ability to be able to punch a button and order up a 4-year-old, or punch a button and order up twins. I mean, this is what's going on. And the fact that prosecutors, which is part of what the Institute is working on, is to educate prosecutors on what this really is. The fact that we're still dealing with prosecutors that simply won't prosecute, don't understand the issue, and perhaps think it's not really a crime. It's a ticketable offense, not a crime. It's not child rape in their minds. Mary, where are you? There you are, stand up. I have to promote. Mary is the producer and director of I Am Jane Doe. If you ever want to take a gut punch on this issue, watch her movie. It comes out May 24th on May 26th on Netflix. Some of you have come to the premieres. It's a true description of what we're up against in this digital age and how difficult it is to not only prosecute these guys, but to to help these kids that have been trafficked online. Their families couldn't even help them. So in my opinion, our biggest challenge that we're facing right now is the digital aspect, the migration of it, the ease of it, and more importantly, facing the fact that at some point we are going to have to, and we need to do it now, talk about the customer, and that's the ick factor in this. People let me talk all day about stopping all this, but then when I start talking about, we got to talk about the customers, then it's like, the customer aspect, both in sex trafficking and in labor trafficking and in the things that you mentioned, is the key to this. It's the absolute key, in my opinion.
Well, let me just follow up on that briefly, because you're exactly right. Prosecutors and judges across this country tend not to deal very seriously with the customers of human trafficking, and the reason is they don't match society's stereotype.
Right.
They are doctors and lawyers and businessmen and school teachers. So how do we persuade the official criminal justice system that their criminality is pretty significant?
Well, training and awareness, that begins our program that we're working on now to train prosecutors and judges and lawyers in general on this issue. But more importantly, talking about it in a language that reflects the crime. These are child rapists. They are raping children. We talk about, oh, it was solicitation, or it was, oh, he was just out. It's not, it's child rape. And until we change the language in this, and also change the language like Arizona just did on how we treat the victims of this. Arizona just removed the word prostitution as it applies to a child. No child is a prostitute, and Arizona took a very bold step and just passed the legislation to stop using that word. It's great. I'm so proud of him. Governor Ducey's amazing on that.
Nick, I know that you've got some extraordinary corporate leaders who have focused on this issue. Pierre Omidyar, Andrew Forrest, and others. Yours is a private sector driven initiative. How do we awaken the rest of corporate leadership? I know one of the things we hear oftentimes in the United States is that business leaders don't really want to talk about this because they're concerned that doing more does nothing but increase their civil liability and their exposure. So how are you going to be successful at the Freedom Fund in really mobilizing corporate leaders around the world?
So the Freedom Fund is a very young organization. We're just on 3 years old. And it was the brainchild of 3 forward-leaning corporate-related foundations, Humanity United, the Omidyars, Walk Free Foundation, Andrew and Nicola Forrest, and Legatum, a Dubai-based private investment firm. They did something, I think, that is far too uncommon in a philanthropic space. Put their egos aside to pool funding for a common cause. And their assessment was there weren't enough resources in this space, and that they could show leadership by not having ownership each of themselves, but pooling the resources to create a vehicle by which others could then join into. So, there's one example I think that is tremendously important and isn't recognized often enough. In terms of corporate leadership, I understand, and I used to be a corporate lawyer, I used to work at Goldman Sachs, I've got kind of the corporate perspective on all of this. I understand the fears of the fact that if you talk about this really difficult issue, you're just laying yourself open for a lawsuit. Well, the reality is, unfortunately, for that point of view, this issue is getting more and more attention anyway because of remarkable work that's been done by Cindy McCain and many others in this room, by the fact that these are actually powerful stories, and the media has kind of twigged to this. And so there is a lot of investment going on into in-depth investigations into corporate supply chains. There is the transparency legislation, but the positive side is that there is a recognition these issues are really, really difficult, and I think there is a real opportunity for corporate leadership, and we're seeing it. Okay, so I'll give you one example. Walmart, probably one of the biggest supply chains in the world with hundreds of thousands of items that it's sourcing from all over the world. And it's realised and recognised that the key facilitator of forced labour is recruitment. Right, where these recruiters get fees from people to put them in jobs, and they deceive people so that they can put them in jobs where they're then exploited. So it's come out with an initiative to say that it wants to ensure there are no recruitment fees paid to anyone working in its supply chain. Apple has done the same, particularly with its work in China. So corporate leaders recognising that this is not only the right thing to do, it's good business, or maybe I should reverse that, but and so there is leadership, and it shows that it can be done. And I think that we're seeing a change in awareness. We're also seeing a change in normative behaviour around this. The work that we've seen at the Vatican, I was fortunate enough to be involved in an initiative 3 years ago, hosted by Pope Francis, where faith leaders from around the world, Pope Francis, Archbishop of Canterbury, Grand Ayatollah of Najaf, leading Sunni clerics, Jewish leaders, Buddhist, Hindu leaders, all came together at the Vatican to sign a joint declaration against modern slavery and to commit their following to ending and stamping out modern slavery. So I think we're seeing this shift, and I think that it's really important that foresightful corporate leaders are at the forefront of that movement.
I think that's really encouraging, and you talk about the power of leadership. There's probably no better example of national leadership on this issue today than the Modern Slavery Act in the United Kingdom. How did that happen? How can we persuade other national leaders to follow the same course, Kevin?
Sure, and it was the frustration that there was different legislation in the UK that wasn't effective, didn't see this as a crime. I mean, first of all, and I think, once we start seeing this as a crime, then you can start building the responses. Because if you see it as more of a social issue, we do know it has all those issues as well. We do know it destroys communities because funds aren't going back to places where people come from. Remittances aren't being returned because they're going to criminals. Young people leave areas, and certain parts of the world lose their young who can actually develop them. So once you start to see the effects this really has on your national but also on your international impact, and then start to build up what the response should be. And the government at the time, all the different parties came together, saw this as an important issue. They put together a committee that took evidence from different groups, from the NGOs, from the victims, from law enforcement, from other agencies, and then they worked on what legislation should look like. Now, one of the sticking pieces was about the supply and the transparency. Was that going to be part of the legislation? And it was actually the private sector that said we need that. Two big companies, it was IKEA and Unilever, that really pushed that, and some of the private investment said, no, you need that, because we need to be part of it. And then how do you then turn that into something that works? So domestically, I'm asking chief officers, police officers to work with our health service, to work with our local governments and local authorities and the CEOs of businesses to make it unacceptable in those areas, to make it unacceptable that forced labor and exploitation exist in their supply chains, because by coming together, they can actually deal with that. And one of the things that was really clear, and which made me understand why we're not seeing this as a crime, was recently in a warehouse in the center of the UK, Sports Direct, a big company, a national company, had people in their warehouse from Poland who were being recruited by criminals and were in exploitation in their warehouse. They weren't being paid. They were being beaten. They were being threatened. Their money was taken from them in the middle of the United Kingdom. And the police interrupted. The police arrested the people. They were prosecuted. And they cut off this whole criminal network, worked with the Poles to identify the people who were doing this back in Poland. But when I was interviewed on the radio, the journalist actually said to me, do you expect companies to respond to this? Do you expect them to check bank accounts? Do you expect them to be able to police this in their businesses? And I said, so if women were being raped and beaten, if people were dealing drugs in that same warehouse, do you think that there should be a response by the company and the law enforcement agencies? I said, because you're not seeing this for what it is. It's a crime against vulnerable people, where they are being traded, turned into a commodity, so that evil criminals can make millions, and as we know, billions across the world, and then fund other criminality. And the director of Europol, Europe's policing agency, has told me recently that it's funding, as I've said already, terrorism, it's funding gun crime, it's funding drugs, because it's a safe way to make your money. And when I met recently and have heard from Nadia Murad, the Yazidi woman who was trafficked and exploited and is now a UN ambassador and speaks powerfully about this, she says, go and prosecute the people that did this to me. Chase them, catch them, and put them in prison. And every time I meet a victim, yes, it is difficult. They have had trauma. But that's what they want. They want this to stop. And there are a lot of things we need to do. But I think actually having good legislation that makes that happen domestically and international is actually essential to actually address this issue.
And let me say, you mentioned the tragedy with the Yazidi girls and women. Minister Bakir is here every year and has been a dynamic champion on behalf of those victims in Kurdistan. I'm glad you're here again. Let me ask Cindy one more question, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. You may remember at this session last year, Senator Heitkamp convened a remarkable conversation involving Cindy and Howard Buffett. And I think all the attendees of the Sedona Forum need to understand that these conversations produce real action. Cindy, you want to talk about that a little bit?
The McCain Institute has been fortunate enough to partner with the Howard Buffett Foundation on a labor trafficking study and actionable item, because that's what we do. But we're starting in Texas, and this is about not saving trafficked people. This is about prosecuting the traffickers. Texas is the weakest link in this, and I don't mean that, I'm just saying from a trafficking standpoint, they have the least amount of prosecutions in this area, so that's why it would have been easier for us to go to California to do this, because the legislation is there, the strength is there. It's not so easy in Texas because there's no underlying law or prosecutorial process there. So we have just begun this study and this actionable item because we believe we're going to be able to produce results, which is prosecuting traffickers, and learn from it and tweak it as we see fit, and hopefully and implant it across the border and, of course, our northern border as well. It's very exciting, and Howard's very driven on this issue. And these are primarily agricultural workers that we're talking about. And the other thing I might add, we are now we're talking about and in the process of putting together a cross-border group that can talk to each other from say an educator to an educator, a pastor to a pastor, et cetera, on this issue and figure out real ways to stop the cross-border trafficking that's happening to individuals, and work together, not fight over this issue. This is not an immigration issue. This is a human rights issue, and that's what we're working on.
Well, I think that really illustrates the point that the McCain Institute is a do tank.
Yeah, it is.
Not a think tank. Real action is happening. So let me throw open the floor for any questions. Anybody have any? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My question quickly, excuse me, about corporates and the business they do and making lots of people vulnerable. And this is not only a human trafficking issue. In 2012, the EU was trying to produce a package of sanctions against the Syrian government communication sector because they were spying activists and used this information to arrest and torture people. Sweden vetoed the sanction package because Ericsson was working in Syria and making lots of money of Syrians' blood. And I had this confrontation with the foreign minister myself in Stockholm. My point here is how, speaking of actions, how feasible to carry these policies and these important research results to places like WTO and try to make the links between free trade and free businesses between nations while maintaining human rights and put the clear principles that we cannot compromise for. Thank you.
You want to take a crack at the...
Sure. I mean, when it comes to human trafficking and modern slavery, I think it's pretty straightforward to make the argument that it's utterly unacceptable. And as long as you can document it and show how it's happening, then you don't run into issues of free trade or, there are not competing interests here. This is criminality, and I think it's a pretty straightforward proposition to establish that. What is far more difficult, of course, is actually documenting this when it's happening in hidden court. I mean, we're seeing, coming out of Syria, we're seeing, I was in the Bekaa Valley just last year to learn much more about the forced labor of Syrian children in the Bekaa Valley. That's not connected to international supply chains, but of course across the border in Turkey, you have garment factories that are grappling with the problem. And these are not straightforward problems, grappling with the problem that their garment factories are employing often underage Syrian workers who are refugees. This is often a life coping strategy, right? So, and there's a very interesting discussion going on about how do we support Syrian refugees in environments like this. And I think the approach that needs to be taken is to not try and just stamp out any issues related to child labour in this kind of situation, but to get a real understanding of the drivers, the approaches that can be made, the policy changes when it comes to Syria. The policy change that we need in Lebanon to tackle forced labour in the Bekaa Valley, among other things, is for the Lebanese government to allow Syrian refugees to work in Lebanon. Right? And so there are multiple approaches that can be taken to deal with an issue that relates to issues of forced labour and the way it connects to supply chains on occasion.
Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, I also think, in a business, to not have modern slavery and people in slavery in your business should not be a feat. It should be the norm. and it's very often about leadership. Once the tops of the companies are saying we're not going to have that, we're not going to tolerate it, it doesn't matter about the rest of the policies. Yes, you need the policies and you need the policing of your businesses, but it has to come right from the top. And once you get it from the top, that will start to filter down. And once companies and businesses say that as the norm, we're not going to have trafficking and modern slavery in our supply chains, we will see that cultural change. We need to change the DNA of the way a company operates so that everybody in that business actually sees the human rights of the individual, the person working, standing next to them, or who works for them, has got equal rights. And once we get to that as the norm, it's an enormous task. I know that. So, that's why we take these tasks on. If they're all easy, everybody would be doing them. But we have to have a response, and so much of it is about the leadership from the top.
And let me just add briefly, we've heard a lot about policy regarding those parts of the world. I think our argument would be this issue needs to be on the agenda as we consider policy in these difficult parts of the world, because it is an integral part of this dynamic. The Yazidi girls were taken by ISIS and auctioned off and sold. And there are lots of examples like that in these parts of the world. This is one of the unrecognized byproducts of these kinds of international tragedies. Other questions? Yes. Ms. Rahman.
I'm Bayan Rahman from Kurdistan region in Iraq, and I'd like to thank you for highlighting the case of the Yazidis. But that raises a question about the use of religion to allow criminality. So ISIS, as you know, Boko Haram, have used Islam to then be able to enslave children and women and enslave them, auction them. In the case of the Yazidis, our government has managed to rescue over 2,000, but about 3,000 remain in captivity. And we know that some of them have been sold and distributed around the Middle East. So how do you deal, we've heard about how you deal with the corporate side, with the law enforcement in countries like the UK where law enforcement is respected. But how do you deal with it when the cloak of religion, and particularly Islam, is used to carry out sexual slavery? In the case of the Yazidis, as you said, Nadia Murad, the most famous victim of ISIS, has called for a hybrid international tribunal to bring the cases to justice, not just locally, but internationally. We find it very hard to get support for this. What do you suggest that we can do to help her?
Anybody want to?
Well, I think, this needs to be discussed on the international stage. It's now being discussed at the Security Council because it's now part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got a target to eradicate this by 2030, target 8.7. So that's a short period of time. Well, that needs to include those difficult to discuss issues, because if we're talking about eradicating this from the globe, it's all of these issues. But what's happened is previously we haven't been talking about it, associating it to the work and the evil work of ISIS and others. And now we are. We need to get those conversations out there and then develop responses to that target those in the way that we would other threats to national security, because that's what this is. It destabilizes, nationally, internationally. It creates this instability where criminals prosper. So I think part of it is happening. Part of it that the debate, a different discussion, we're here today talking about this wouldn't have happened 4 or 5 years ago. So the fact that we've got in this agenda, we've got it on the UN's agenda. But, this term, a do tank, I think that's what we need to do. We need to be doing, we need to be delivering, we need to be making the changes. We need to be there making sure that we're giving protection. We need to be supporting the victims. And in the UK alone, we have nearly 4,000 victims came forward last year. When I checked that against police records, they weren't recording them as crimes. They weren't listening to the cases of victims. When I've been to Greece and Italy and I've met victims, they will tell me the routes they come from. When I was in Nigeria, I met 13 victims. They even told me the addresses they were being kept at in Italy. But the international community, law enforcement, all our big agencies that we've got, weren't sitting down and listening to them like they do when someone gets attacked in the streets of Phoenix or New York or London or Glasgow or wherever it may be. Get that intelligence, listen to the facts, and then build your response. and make that a professional response that is commensurate to the risk this presents. But at the moment, 150 million US dollars a year, billion US dollars a year by the criminals, and almost nothing by the international community. It's an unfair fight, and we need to change that.
Nick?
I mean, among the many obscenities of Boko Haram and ISIS is the fact that they are they are going out and celebrating the fact they are selling human beings. Right? We thought we'd at least established a norm where this was unacceptable and people were doing it as a hidden crime. But what I would say, with absolutely no ability to claim any expertise on Islamic law, is that leading Islamic scholars will say this is utter perversion of Islam, and scholars Grandi Mamakara have come out and said this is an utter perversion of Islam. So I don't think we hold this up as anywhere the mainstream of Islamic thought. What we do have to do is show that there can be accountability. It's going to be a long path, but we've seen in places like the Balkans that we can hold those perpetrators accountable over time. And I think a lot more work needs to go into collecting evidence, in-depth investigations, and basically re-establish the norm that selling human beings is utterly unacceptable and will be punished.
We're at the end time. Let me give Cindy the last word. And my question to you for the last word is, you have this extraordinary audience of world leaders, business leaders, advocates, activists. What can they do to make a difference in this area?
Well, first of all, I like to leave action items for everyone. I like to leave you with an action item. Number one, check your own supply chains. Go back, research. Do research on your own businesses, on your own communities. Number two, check your investments. Research your investments. How are your investments, or are they involved in any way that could possibly be human trafficking? You'd be surprised what you might find in there. And number three, be active on a local level. And I bring back the locality of this, because the more we can work together as communities on this issue, legislatively, for victims, whatever way you might find interesting in this, working together is how we fix this. Because the problem that, as the commissioner was so eloquent about, is that we're not working together. There's reinvention of the wheel, there's people doing this, they want to protect their own mailing list, they want to, I mean, it's any number of things. This issue is too important to not work together. We're talking about human lives. And so if I could leave anybody with anything, that would be what I would suggest that you do and that you take home from this.
Thank you. And let me say thank you to Nick and Kevin and obviously Cindy for their inspired leadership. I think there's greater progress being made today on these issues than ever before, but it's abundantly clear we have a long way to go.
And Ernie, I'd like to thank you for all you have done for the many, many years that you've been involved in this issue. You are a rock star on this issue.
Thank you.